Hi, and welcome to Take Every Thought Captive, our weekly look at the Catholic intellectual tradition and an exploration of the authors, books, and topics that have shaped Catholic thinking for 2,000 years. My name is Jason Gale. I'm joined this week by Dr. Benjamin Smith, our lecturer in philosophy at Catholic Studies Academy. And as we get started today, I want to invite everybody, please hit that subscribe button, hit that notification bell so that whenever we put out new content, you'll get notifications. Because we also have other videos and other things on our website and on our YouTube channel where we have shorter videos in theology and philosophy that we are just trying to really provide some sort of way for Catholics to think deeper about the things that we talk about here on the podcast and a lot of other things. And you know, the name of our podcast is Take Every Thought Captive, which we take from 2 Corinthians 10:4-5, which we say the weapons we fight with are not the weapons of the world. On the contrary, they have divine power to demolish strongholds. We demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God. And we take every thought captive to make it obedient to Christ. And our topic today is just one of those topics that we're trying to defeat. And it's one that's very just prevalent all over our society. And both Dr. Smith and I think it's causing quite a bit of harm, not just to our society and culture as a whole, but also to the individual human person. And this goes back to some of the topics we've talked about before with the myth of self. So if you haven't listened to those episodes, go back and listen to those. They'll provide a great foundation for what we're going to talk about today. And the topic for today is, okay, we've talked about the myth of self. We've talked about these erroneous ideas about it. But how can we have authentic self-understanding? Because it is very important that we do have authentic self-understanding, because there's many errors out there,
Right.
About how, well, everything is, and we'll talk about this, how everything is this kind of undefined consciousness or something like that. And how, everything is simply left to the autonomy of the self, that we can determine absolutely everything about us.
Sure.
And that's simply not the case.
Right.
And in fact, it's anti-Christian. And so what we want to do is kind of turn and look and see, okay, so we've talked about some of the problems and the issues with it, but let's look at what is an authentic self-understanding. How do we come about that in a healthy way? I mean,
Sure.
Because that's the other aspect of it, is the kind of, even just contributing to the mental health of our society. So Dr. Smith, as we get started here, for a topic like this, what would you say to somebody, why is this important to have this? What does it matter if how I define myself or how I discover myself? Does it really matter? Or, what's a big deal?
Yeah, right. It's a big deal if you get it completely wrong, right? I think that's what you want to say. It's like, it's all well and good until you think you can fly and you can't. And I think what we have here is a situation in which we've latched on this idea, like you said, I think rightly, Jason, latched on this idea of autonomy being law unto yourself to such a degree that even means that we should be able to define ourselves, become our own creator, so to speak. Put it in kind of Nietzschean terms, to be our own, to be the artist of ourselves, right? That's problematic because it's false, right? It's delusional. It doesn't lead us to a true and authentic understanding of ourselves. And we want to live in reality, right? We don't want to live in delusion or fantasy, right? If we live in delusion and fantasy, then we'll get things wrong. We'll live poorly. We'll make decisions that are uninformed. We'll relate to others in ways that are unfortunate and harmful. And we'll miss, the true purpose, right, of our being, which is packed into our being. Does that make sense, right?
Yeah.
Like, we have a purpose. That purpose is objective. But if you get your being wrong, then that purpose you're going to lose. And that's the true tragedy of life, right? As I teach my kids all the time, the most important thing, right, is the ultimate end.
Yeah.
And if you get everything else wrong and everything else goes badly in your life, if you're acting for the ultimate end, you're succeeding, you're thriving, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's okay to fail school and win life.
That's right, exactly.
But
Yeah.
it's horrible to to pass school and fail life.
That's right. Yeah,
You
that's a good
know,
way of putting it, Jason.
and also, you know, I mean, for the Christian, the goal, you know, the goal of the Christian life is to make a sacrifice of yourself in imitation of Christ himself. You know, you can't do that unless you have this knowledge, this possession of yourself. That scripture even talks about self-possession, you know,
Right.
that you can't give what you don't have. That's a basic
Sure.
philosophical
Right.
principle.
Yeah.
If you don't possess yourself in a way that's based on reality and free from, you know, addictions and sin, it'll be very hard to make a true gift to yourself in
Right.
a similar way as Christ did. So, I mean, for the Christian, this goes to, you know, what we're going to talk about really goes, I think, to the heart of living an authentic Christian life with
Right.
bravery and with courage.
Yeah. I think that's right, Jason.
Yeah. All right. So kick us off here with how do we begin to develop this authentic self-understanding?
Sure. First, I just think it'll be helpful to kind of review just in
Yeah.
brief a couple of the points we talked about in our 2 previous episodes on this issue. The one is that, you know, the myth of the self, right, is the false modern idea of the self,
Yeah.
which is the idea of undefined consciousness. So you're aware, but you have no definition, and because of your awareness, you're capable of defining yourself however you like, right? And this is really coupled with a methodology for self-discovery that's false, right? So you have a false idea, right, namely of the self, namely undefined consciousness. That's coupled with a false method of self-knowledge, namely a kind of intuitive introspection in which you abstract from what's called the separate self, right?
Yeah.
You abstract from and you detach from the separate self. The separate self is all of those external relationships, definitions that try to codify you or describe you in external ways. So in bodily terms, historical terms, relational terms like husband or wife or father or son, those sorts of things, right? That's not the real self. That's merely conventional, merely social and contingent.
Yeah.
Right?
Society's pushing those on you. Yeah.
That's right. Exactly. So you got to break free from all that, right? And go inside yourself. And then, right, you can kind of discover your inner self or whatever you want to call it, right? So in religious settings, that often ends up kind of veering into kind of something like pantheism. We talked about that last time.
Yeah.
You know, that as an undefined consciousness, I am without limit, which makes me like the limitless thing that is God.
Yeah, it's a frightening place to be.
That's right. Yeah, those are not my words. Those are Richard Rohr, by the way. So look that up if you want to. But anyway, so that is the kind of general picture we have. I think that should be familiar. Like almost every movie, like it's like how many movies are based on that script, right?
Oh yeah.
I've got to break free from being externally defined in this way, and then I find my inner consciousness by, I don't know, walking on the beach and thinking about how I'm not defined by my marriage to my wife.
Yeah, I remember in high school doing this where, you know, you watch one of those movies where it's like this, you know, internal journey, but they like go on some epic road trip, and like me and my friends tried that, and it was not like the movie. We just
it's kind of boring.
Yeah, we ended up getting pulled over, like not very fun. We got lost. Yeah, I mean, it was not like the movies at all. This whole Don't try it.
Don't try it. So I think, you know, in order to kind of avoid this trap and the kind of fantasy and delusion that it leads to, I think, you know, what we want to do is develop a better understanding of the self. But I think that requires us to have a better sense of what we mean by understanding. What we need is a better model of knowledge and learning. And thankfully, that's available to us, right? And it's actually kind of common sense. You know, to give it a philosophical term, phrase, or description, we can call it classical realism. And we've had a previous episode on classical realism. I think it's really helpful to go back to that one. I think that's when we got we got that one pretty well, Jason. I think we got,
Don't
that
want
was
to
a
brag,
good one.
but
Yeah, but I'm just saying. The basic idea here, the foundation of classical realism, is a view that the proper object of the intellect is truth, right?
mm-hmm.
That is, that the intellect is ordered towards truth. It's inclined towards truth, which means to say that it's inclined towards reality. So that when we find our intellect being actualized, being stimulated, when we find our intellect in operation, that's because it's in contact with, to some degree or the other,
Mm-hmm.
with being, with reality, right? And so since our intellects are ordered towards truth, right, we can think that they're reliable, that the intellect is reliable, right? And then we want to discover how is it that truth emerges, right? How is it that truth is discovered in the intellect? And the way Thomas articulates this, and again, he's in a lot of ways following Aristotle, is to think about it in terms of experience, to think about it in terms of direct experience of external objects. So things outside of our own consciousness, okay, not inside the consciousness, but external to the consciousness, right? And that in that experience, through sensation, right, through seeing, touching, hearing, etc., we experience reality. Now, does that make sense, Jason?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, like you said, it's common sense. Like this is the way that we operate every day. You know, we see things, we react to them. Operating a car, you turn it on, you step on the gas, you step on the brake. Like you're perceiving things, you're making decisions, life and death decisions with gas pedals and things.
That's right.
But you're again you're basing it on reality, you're basing it on sense perception. I mean, if you even Pope Benedict has made comment on this before, that if we didn't operate this way, life would just be completely unlivable.
Right. Yeah. That's true. And one of the things, it would be unlivable. And as I say, it's not true to life, right? It's not true to the way we act at all.
Yeah.
It's to deny this approach, right? And I think it's very important to recognize the external orientation and the way in which this involves direct engagement with things outside of ourselves, right? One of the chief errors of modern philosophy has been in epistemology, and this is recognized by a wide variety of historians and thinkers, has been to think of the primary or the first object of knowledge as being inside of us.
Yeah.
Right. If you put it on that model and then think, so how do I know that the thing inside of me matches the thing outside of me? Well, that's 200 years of modern skepticism right there. Right? Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And we don't want to go down that path again. We already know where that leads. So stop it. Right. What we want to do instead is to recognize in a straightforward way that what's given in experience is our direct engagement with objects outside of consciousness.
Yeah.
Consciousness doesn't float in a vat. It always has an object.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And again, this is the kind of the practical nature of the truth within this. I mean, this is the way. And I think one thing also to point out to our listeners is, when we talk about the senses, we're not just talking about the eyes, ears, smell, taste, those kind of things, right? Maybe you could just bring in here, how do we engage, because Thomas brings up the internal senses, and I think this is something that even Catholics we forget about, that when we're talking about the experience of senses, it's not just we are taking in these objects for the first time, but no, those objects are interacting with our internal senses. So what are those for our listeners there?
Sure. Yeah. So it's a complex topic, but at least two things that ought to come out here is one is imagination, not in terms of concocting things, but in our ability to re-experience objects through images, right?
Yeah.
That is, that we can I can close my eyes and see my parents' house.
Sure.
right, without actually being in front of my parents' house, right? That's imagination. Notice I'm not making something up that doesn't exist,
Yeah.
right? Rather, I am imaging, literally, right? Something that I'm not directly seeing, but have seen. And that brings in, of course, also the role of memory, right?
Yep.
So that memory and imagination, so with memory, we get sequence, we get time, we get duration added into that as well. And then also we have a faculty called, the common sense. Now this gets a little bit, I don't mean by common sense what we
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
but it's a sense power that allows us to experience the unity of things, right?
Yeah.
So we experience things with sequence, with duration, with remembered and relived images, kind of re-experienced experiences, and as I say, with time and in space, right? So that we experience the things as they are unified in space, insofar as they're proximate to one another. So it's
Yeah.
kind of a rich, multi-layered kind of thing that we're talking about here.
Yeah. Yeah. So when we're talking about, knowledge, gaining knowledge through experience, we're not just talking about like a video camera just takes in everything
Mhm.
and it is later then processed. Like
Right, right,
like this
right.
is like this is the human person's a little bit more dynamic than a
That's right.
camera.
Sure.
That all of these things are coming into play, and that kind of myth of self
Hmm.
area, or the myth of self error, really says that, those things, while they may be important, or maybe
Hmm.
they're not important, that's for you
Uh-huh.
to decide,
That's for you to
and for you
decide.
to
Yeah.
reject
Right.
how you interact with
Uh-huh.
those, your memory,
Hmm.
your imagination,
Right. Yeah.
that's all up to you, where
That's true. That's true. Whereas, I think from a classical realist perspective, right, we say, no, it's not all up to you. It's given. It's there, right? It's impacting you. It's you're experiencing it. Sometimes whether you like it or not, right? That's one of the things that's kind of interesting about experience, right? Stuff happens and it's not always what you desire, right? But it's still real, right? And
yeah.
so that in our experience, the real is given. Now, that doesn't mean it's always obvious. Often it is obvious, but sometimes it's complicated and difficult and you have to figure it out. But it doesn't follow that the real isn't given in experience and through our sensations of things, through, vision and sight and imagination and memory, right?
Hmm.
So that's, I think, a good, sort of, there's a lot more to say, of course,
Yeah, sure.
in terms of epistemology, the study of knowledge, for full, kind of course in that, or a fuller treatment. We have that both as a course, but also, as an episode on classical realism. So, you might want to look back at that. But if you adopt this approach, what's important for our purposes here is if you adopt a classical realist approach, which again is kind of a common sense approach,
Hmm.
then you're going to get a much more definite and clear understanding of yourself, right? Definite, clear, and accurate, true, right? Authentic understanding of yourself, right? Because instead of defining it on the basis of some sort of mystical or whatever, some sort of intuition of yourself,
Yeah.
right? Inside of yourself, you're going to be instead relying on the path towards reality, right? Which has to do with experience and intellect,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
And that's exactly what St. Thomas lays out for us in the first part of the Summa. So if you think of, look at the Summa Theologia, it famously has this kind of weird division, right? You have the first part, then you have the first part of the second part, the second part of the second part, and then the third part. So we're in the first part of the Summa, the prima pars in Latin. And the first part concerns God and the angels and man and the governance of the world, right? So it's very much sort of like, here's your kind of metaphysical, cosmological picture of things, right? All the way from God down to man, down to the governance of things, right?
Hmm.
In later parts of the Summa, we shift more towards things about ethics and things about the sacraments and things of that nature, the spiritual life. So the prima pars, right, we get sort of the taxonomy of things, right? The ontology of things, including man. And he has a wonderful treatment of the human person as body and soul, right?
Mm-hmm.
Very important, right? It's one of, you always want to cling on to that. You're not body, you're not soul, you're not soul in the body, you're body and soul. That's a conjunction.
That's right.
And
a good composite.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. We're composite beings, right? Soul, body, and soul. And as he's going through that, right, he actually develops a fairly robust psychology that is a study, a model, an understanding of the psyche, both in terms of its ontological status, namely what is the soul,
mm-hmm.
but also in terms of its operations, right?
Yeah.
This is an aspect of, I think, Thomism and Thomist thought that sometimes goes underappreciated, is really just how sophisticated Thomas's account of the psyche is. One of the things that's really great about it is it's just going to sound weird at first, Jason, right? But it's an account of the psyche that's not introspective, right? And that kind of grates, right? At first,
therefore, we should do away with it, right? Because it's old.
Right. Yeah, that's right. It's interesting though, right? Because so much of psychology today, contemporary psychology, is introspective. Now, there has been, I think, some corrective about this in
Sure.
more recent years, in terms of trying to use statistical models and things of that nature. But especially when you're thinking about the early periods of modern psychology, and I think still the case with pop psychology. I mean, especially if you get your psychology from Oprah Winfrey or some revival source like that. That it's overwhelmingly introspective, right?
Oh yeah.
Somehow you're looking inside yourself, right, in order to find the operations of your psyche. That's not Thomas's view, right? Just like he endorses a kind of a classical realist model of knowledge, he also endorses, concomitant with that, a view of the psyche, right, that I would call psychological realism, right? That is, we learn about the psyche through engagement with reality, not through introspection.
Or divine navel gazing, as we like to call it here.
Right. What do you think about that, Jason?
Yeah, no, it sounds very old and out of date, but at the same time, I think it's one of those things that I think for the Christian living today, it's refreshing. Because I think there is a very much a Thomas's approach here. It simply speaks to how we experience reality and how we operate our lives, whereas much of the modern approach is just it's there's a real flaw in it that I think frustrates the human mind. I mean, the whole, there's all these self-help books that tell you just to go inside yourself and find the answer. Well, it's like, no, that's why I'm going to a book.
That's right.
I'm going outside of myself because I can't figure myself out. I can't fix myself. So I mean, there's this, I think Thomas is ever refreshing. And, again, I think it can really provide some sane wisdom.
Right. That's right.
And this time of seemingly unforgiving insanity.
Right. Unforgiving insanity. I like that. So the way Thomas frames this is to think about it in terms of the intellect knowing itself. So how does the intellect come to know itself? Mm-hmm. And really interestingly, he thinks about it this way. He says, well, something is knowable, right, insofar as it is actual. Sounds good.
Yeah.
Right? Right? If it doesn't exist, it's not knowable, right? If it's a sheer nothing, it can't be thought.
Yeah.
Can't be understood, right? Think about undefined consciousness, right? Right. If it's not something actual or definite, it can't be understood. Now, anybody that knows much about Thomas's view of things, that he follows Aristotle in thinking that we need to articulate our metaphysics in terms of being, non-being, and potential being, right? But there's potential being. It's not as if the intellect doesn't exist, but it's important to recognize that real things have both actual being and potential being, things like us, and that anything that's known is known not insofar as its potential, but insofar as it is actual.
Yeah.
Okay. Now that also goes for our own intellect, for the intellect itself, right?
Yeah.
If you want a reference, I'm not going to read it because it's fairly dense, but look at, and maybe Jason, we could put a link here for your text here, Prima Pars, that's part 1, question 87, article 1. And he lays out this principle. Okay, so a thing is knowable insofar as it's actual. Right? That also goes for the intellect. When the intellect itself is the object of knowledge, it is only knowable insofar as it is actual. Okay.
Yeah, and a good way to understand this is what he's talking about here is why we get so frustrated with what if questions. Because the actual matters. We can what if till we're blue in the face, but the actual is the thing that we are engaging with. The actual is the thing that matters. That we can't just kind of fall into this like infinite potentiality. Right. But a thing is knowable insofar as it is actual. All right. Hope that clarifies a little bit.
That's right. So that will be true also of the intellect. Yeah. So the intellect itself is knowable insofar as it's actual rather than potential. Now, one of the things that's very clear, right, is that our intellect is not fully and always in act, right? It has an inclination towards the truth, like any power of the soul, but it's not always or fully actual, right? Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. Right. Sometimes it is to a greater degree. Sometimes it is to a lesser degree. Right. So interestingly, right, he raises the question whether or not the intellect knows itself by its essence, right, or by our own essence. And he says no, right, because we're not essentially in act. We're a mix of act and potency. And this is the same with our own intellect. Have you ever forgotten something or had to relearn it?
Every day.
Yeah, there you go. Right. At one point, you actually knew. So my kids are at the age where I'm helping them with math, and I'm having to kind of relearn a lot of it, right? Which actually, to be perfectly frank, I mean, this is pretty nerdy, but I'm kind of really enjoying it, right? Because I don't think I got it the first time. Like I think I just kind of eke by, originally, but like learning about fractions and turning fractions into to percentages and stuff. This is great.
Oh yeah, diagramming sentences. I'm having so much fun.
So, but that shows you, like, at one point I understood that stuff to some degree, and then I didn't, and now I'm having to relearn it. Right. So I go from having an actual knowledge of things like factoring, right, to not having an actual knowledge of it and having an actual knowledge of it again. Right. So this shows us, right, that our intellect is not always in act, right? Sometimes it's in act and sometimes it's in potency. Then the key question is, so everybody follow along here, a thing is knowable insofar as it's actual. That means that the intellect is knowable and insofar as it's actual, right? But sometimes the intellect is in act and sometimes it's in potency. So then the real question is, what is it that puts the intellect into act? What is it that actualizes intellect? Right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's engagement with reality.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. Right. So the intellect isn't actualized by thinking itself first.
Right.
You're right. When I read that in Thomas, I was like, oh, thank God somebody said that, because there's all kinds of mounds of philosophy in which it was all about the mind knowing itself first and then trying to know reality.
Yeah.
Well, that's just a dead end, as I already mentioned. Okay. And it's not true to experience.
Right.
We don't know the intellect first. We first engage with the external objects. That's when the intellect is actualized, right? The intellect is actualized by its encounter with sensible qualities of external real things, right?
Yeah.
And that's how the intellect comes to know, right? Comes to be an act Okay. This is different than angelic intellects.
Mm-hmm.
It's different than the divine intellect. The divine intellect is always in act. The angelic intellect is contingently in act, but what it knows is itself, its own essence. But the human intellect is actualized first and foremost by external sensible things, right? That's what
Material things.
that's what our intellect is set up to do.
Yeah, and like you said, it sounds very simple, but it has, if you get this wrong, which our current society does a lot of times, it everything else that follows is going to be off.
That's right.
If our first movement is to sit there and to think about ourselves thinking, then or to or that kind of engagement with just yourself, well,
right.
It's going to fall flat.
That's right. Absolutely. So what we discover here, right, if we take this right approach, is that that we are so we know external things first. Then we can know, because then the intellect's an act.
Yeah.
I discover about myself. What am I? I'm a knower. I'm a knower of the external world. I am an agent of truth, right? An agent inclined towards reality, an agent that is defined, not really an agent that's sort of defined by the fact that I have an internal relationship to something outside of myself, namely reality. Right.
You can't say I'm a knower. Okay, what do I know? Well, nothing. And that's why we have to first know something in order to say, okay, I'm a thinking person now. I've thought about this bookshelf in front of me, or I've thought about this tree in front of me. I know a little bit about this tree. I know a little bit about this bookshelf. Therefore, I'm a thinker. I'm a knower. There has to be that engagement with material, sensible things first in order to engage us as human persons. And again, for the order of our knowledge, it has to go this way.
That's right. Absolutely. Yeah. So what I discover about myself when I am actualized, when the mind is actualized, is that I'm a knower, right? I'm an agent of truth, right? I am something that's ordered towards and is actualized in achieving the truth, right? So that something outside of myself, namely reality, right, is actually kind of defining of me or my relationship to something outside of myself. In addition to that, when I reflect on my on my knowing, I find that my knowing is very often accompanied by willing, right? And what I do is, again, these are all complex topics, but when I reflect on my mind and act, what I find is that it's accompanied by intentions, right, and by choices. Right? Intentions to avoid things, intentions to achieve things, choices to avoid things, choices to achieve things, right? And then, so that in when I reflect on my knowing process, I also discover myself as someone who not only knows the good, but is capable, at least, right, of intending and choosing the good, right?
Yeah.
So that I find about myself, again, when I'm in act towards the external world, right, what I actually find is I'm an agent of truth and love, right? Yeah. Again, the good here is not a good I find inside of myself, right, but a good that's discovered outside of myself, right? It's not internal to consciousness, right? It's not consciousness itself. It's something that the intellect recognizes as a good feature of reality, right?
Yeah.
Does that,
Yeah. And we're not saying that the intellect is always correct. The intellect could be mistaken, but the intellect is what gives the will its object to move towards. And it's not something that's just within myself. It's it's something that engages the outside world, that engages that material world.
Yeah, so absolutely. Yeah, I think it's that engagement with reality, right? Is that what we're doing is we're knowing reality, we're understanding reality, we're intending certain features of reality, choosing certain features of reality, right? What we find is that man discovers himself and his identity as a knower and as a lover through engagement with external objects,
Yeah, and
things outside of his consciousness, right?
that's the key principle here with the whole topic of coming to an authentic self-understanding is that in this basic form, how the mind comes to know, and how we come to know that we are knowers, is through our engagement with knowing external objects.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. I think it's so key and so healthy and so opposite, right?
Yes.
This false sense of the self, right? Which is all this kind of like self-obsessive, you call it navel gazing, right? I mean, just, self-defining. And I think people really get caught up in this. And the problem is, and this is what's so frustrating, they're depriving themselves of the very things that would help them answer their questions.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
There are answers to these questions, but they're saying, well, I can't, that's a separate self. I can't identify myself that way. And then they're caught up in this frustrating process of a frustrating and really useless process of self-discovery, that ends up in nothing, right? Ends up in delusion, or just frustration, right? Whereas the truth is, we come, and if I could be a little more expansive here, we come to know and understand ourselves most truly and accurately in knowing and loving others, right?
Yeah, and I'll give you a clear example. I've seen this time and time again, and if especially if you have teenagers,
Right.
or anything like that, like, because I was a youth minister for years, and I had
God bless you, Jason.
What are you talking about? It's great. But it is. It's very rewarding, but it's also it's absolutely fascinating because the adolescent mind and everything is really struggling with this identity question and trying to do this.
Right.
And so many times we would take kids on like mission trips and things like that. And several of the ones that we did where kids would be, broken up into groups, so they're with people they don't know, and they're going to serve a community that they don't know, and in many times particular people that they've never met in their life, and they're asked to give of themselves. They're not getting paid for any of this stuff. In fact, they had to pay to go on this thing, or at least their parents did.
Sure.
But at the end of the mission trip or the week, we would I would help them process kind of the things that they're experiencing, helping them interpret it in light of the gospel. And so many times the kids would say, I know it seems that we help these people a little bit, but I feel like I got so much more out of it
right
than I think that I provided to them. And so I'd help guide them through it and everything, and it's because and again, it goes to the truth of also scripture, right? It is in giving that you receive,
right?
That again, this is part of God's design for us, as our minds are ordered towards the truth, and that truth is outside of ourselves, and we can discover it in that way. And when we discover it, we actually understand more about ourselves. And so but our world really turns it upside down, and just says, well, everything is within you, you make all the decisions, your autonomy is the highest virtue, and yada 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 yada. Broken world.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, absolutely, Jason.
But I think we've all had that experience where with whether it be something spontaneous, where somebody needs something and we help them out, or something like that. You're like, wow, or it could be the other way around. You're like, wow, I'm a rotten person, but something more about yourself, based on your interactions with the things outside of yourself.
Absolutely.
You can't just go on this internal road trip with little Creedence Clearwater in the background and just expect to find yourself. You can't.
Hey, CCR.
I'm
CCR.
Not my favorite road trip in music. But
if anybody's younger than 30, they're like, who the heck are you talking about?
Yeah, go look them up. They're great.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Again, kind of less formally speaking, but this idea of finding yourself and giving yourself away. That's something that we all experience at different times. For some reason, even when we experience it, we have this kind of, and I would chalk it up to original sin, kind of tendency to kind of forget it, though, right? Kind of fall back into our kind of native selfishness, and self-centeredness. But sure, like that sense of being. Sometimes people talk about being part of something bigger than yourself.
Yeah,
that sort of thing. I think that's one of the things that we love about, certainly about aesthetic experience. That when we have that, probably the most common way of defining it is when something is so beautiful and so attractive, right, that we lose our sense of ourselves, right, and are absorbed by that thing that's outside of ourselves, right? Yeah. For myself, this is most often, like a lot of people, like in terms of engagement with nature, that when you have that beautiful vista, or the powerful ocean, right, that kind of thing, that you're drawn outside of the boundaries of your own just sort of consciousness and so forth, right, into something beyond yourself. That's great, right? Because that's actually where we discover ourselves most, right?
Yeah. And the other thing, I mean, I don't know, this is just my take on it, but I even find many of those experiences are usually quite humbling.
Sure.
Like you look at if you're sitting on the beach and you're looking at a sunset, or you're standing on a mountain and you're looking out over just thousands and thousands of acres, you're humbled. You feel small. Whereas all of modern psychology tells you how great you are, and how nothing is really a sin. And I mean, it's just building up your pride. Whereas I think this engagement with that we're talking about here, a lot of times it's humbling,
that's true. That's true. Yeah. Because you might be engaged with somebody else and figure out, man, that person's really a lot smarter than I am. Right? Yeah. And then you're like, okay, well, that's part of knowledge of myself too. And that's okay. That's part of who and what I am. I think there's a lot more we could say here, Jason, but I think we've probably given our listeners at least a framework for this, right? Is that the authentic understanding of the self, it arrives not from thinking about the self first, right? That's why the whole self-discovery thing is misguided, right?
Yeah.
Because you don't find yourself by looking for yourself. You find yourself and you discover the truth about yourself through knowing and loving things outside of yourself, through knowing and loving others, right? I think that resonates with our experience in life. I think that resonates with our relationships, our friendships, our romantic relationships, all those sorts of things, right? And is so much more fruitful, right? And offers, I think, a clear and powerful alternative to the introspective, undefined consciousness, fruitless path that's so often proposed to us.
Yeah, and I think it also provides a very kind of simple pathway for Christians, right? Love everybody. Like even your enemies. Like there's a real simplicity to it, but at the same time, it is it's in all of those little things that we can, like Mother Teresa says, doing those little things with great love. Like those are going to be the things that tell you about yourself. That's and many times the more we do this, actually the less absorbed we are from with ourselves.
Right. Yeah,
which is this weird Christian paradox where we begin to, okay, I want to understand myself. Well, Christ says, give everything away, or give of yourself and you'll receive. And so I do that, and all of a sudden, you know what, I don't care about myself anymore. Like it's this weird kind of, again, the paradox of the cross, the sign of contradiction. I think it's just so key, but for our listeners especially, be able to recognize this kind of false psychology that's out there, that's just completely self-absorbed, and it doesn't lead to virtue. It actually leads more to vices. And to look for this what you coined, psychological realism.
That's right.
So the more we can engage with the things that are outside of ourselves by knowing and loving other people, by knowing and loving external objects, we come to know ourselves better.
Right. Absolutely.
And that's where we begin. That's kind of the first step to all this. All right, Dr. Smith, I think we've given our listeners a lot to think about today, and I hope that they will, I know it sounds very simple, but if you just go look at a self-help section of any bookstore that's still there, it's so prevalent.
It may sound simple, but it's really important. And I think there's just a lot of practical use, both for yourself, and for your children, but also for your friends. Like when you get into these kind of conversations about, I just don't really know anything about myself anymore, or whatever that might be, oh, really? Like you can say, when I think about these issues, I think about my children. I think about, the woman I love. I think about my country. I think about, those sorts of things. And I've, there it is, like I can actually identify myself, right?
Yeah. And it's not all self-imposed, or
you don't need a guru.
Anyway. All right. Well, I hope all of our listeners have enjoyed this. Please go and check out all of our content over at CatholicStudiesAcademy.com. We have full classes in epistemology and other aspects of philosophy taught by Dr. Smith here. In the meantime, God bless.